Welcome to our podcast, where we talk about the interesting, frustrating, and inspiring experiences we have as people with strongly held religious views working in corporate IT. We're not here to preach or teach you our religion. We're here to explore ways we make our career as IT professionals mesh, or at least not conflict. With our religious life, this is technically religious.
Last year, CiscoLive fell squarely in the middle of Ramadan, which created a challenge for followers of Islam. Here in 2019, it coincided with the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, meaning that many observant Jews had to skip or cut short their attendance. Between these special situations and the more common stresses of finding a place to pray, sometimes multiple times a day, navigating dozens of interactions where we find ourselves explaining our religious limitations regarding food, venues, and even personal contact, and asserting boundaries between the requirements of our work and the tenets of our faith, between all those challenges, it's a wonder we choose to attend conferences and conventions at all. In this episode, we're going to hear from a few folks about how we survive and even thrive in this environment while holding strong to our religious values or moral or ethical points of view. I'm Leon Adato, and the other voices you're going to hear on this episode are Rasheed, who's a SysAdmin for a federal contractor.
Hello.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Mike Wise, a freelance consultant in insurance technology and specializing in blockchain.
Hello.
And finally, a returning guest, Keith Townsend from CTO Advisor.
Well, evidently the unedited version of the podcast hasn't gotten me kicked off. Hello.
Right. I'm not going to give the number, but there is one where I forgot to post the edited version. Okay, so before we dive into this topic, I want to give everyone a chance for some shameless self-promotion. Al, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm a SysAdmin here in the Northern Virginia area for a federal contractor. I am a Palestinian American, born in Jerusalem, and I am Muslim as well. You can find me on Twitter, Al_Rasheed, Rasheed, and my blog post is also listed on my Twitter profile. It's alarasheedblog.wordpress.com.
Perfect. Mike, how about you next?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for having me on the show. You can find me at Mike.Wise07 on pretty much every social channel, including Twitter. I'm doing a lot of tweeting. I'm also sharing a lot on LinkedIn, and my website is blockchainwisdom.com. It's a play on my name.
Nice. Keith, for those people who might have missed the other episodes you're in, where can we find you?
At CTO Advisor on the Twitters, which my daughter hates to say. And you can find the blog, CTOAdvisor.com.
Great. And just to round things out, I'm Leon Adato. You can find me on Twitter, on the Twitters. I'll say that just to make Keith's daughter's skin crawl. You can find me there at Leon Adato. And my blog is adatosystems.com. And as a reminder, all of the links and all the things that we're talking about today are going to be in the show notes. So if you're scribbling madly, don't worry about it. There is a place where this is all written down. So where I want to start with this, just for a little bit, is to talk about how conventions are challenging in general. A lot of folks who listen to this podcast may not be lucky enough, have the privilege to go to conventions, and maybe you're thinking, it sounds like a vacation, man. You go to Vegas or Orlando. It's nothing but fun. You get to go to, So why are conventions challenging, just generally speaking? And I'm going to start this one off and say that, you have to deal with time zones, sometimes 2 or 3. I actually have one of my coworkers, Sascha Giese, is from Germany. So he'll travel 4 or 5 time zones, not to mention 12 hours at a shot, to get to some of these places. So you're just generally exhausted and generally sort of strung out. And then you have to hit the ground running, attending classes, and, just think, your brain has to be at its peak performance. So that's one of the first things that people don't expect. What else is there?
Well, I hate people.
People suck. People suck.
You know what? For someone with 7,000 plus whatever Twitter followers and as much social media that I do, crowds are just too much for me. VMworld is going to be 20-something thousand. AWS reInvent is 40-something thousand, and I go and I just get exhausted.
Right. So yeah, if you're not an extrovert, if you're an introvert, then that by itself can be draining. Absolutely. What else? Al, you had something we talked about before we started.
Staying in touch with your spouse and or your kids. I'm fortunate where my wife has tagged along on some recent conferences with me. Also, we're blessed because both of our kids are old enough to mind for themselves, care for themselves. but you always have to remain in contact, keep tabs on them, and just make sure they're safe.
Yeah, that never, no matter how old they are, that never ends.
It's a juggling act between personal and professional.
Yeah, you definitely have to juggle. So not only the wife and kids, the spouse and kids, but also, Mike, to your point, you have to juggle other aspects of your life too, right?
Yeah, that's right. You've got, we all live in the blur, right? And so we've got personal stuff going on, we've got professional stuff going on, we've got community things that we're involved in, boards, everything's constantly happening at the same time, and it's all going right through our mobile device. So it's really challenging.
Yeah, there are times when you're walking through a convention and you don't even know you're there because the screen in front of you is taking precedence over it. All right, so for those people who haven't been to conventions, that's just a taste of why they're not a vacation. There can be aspects of it that are vacation-like, and I think that it's important for those of us who attend conventions often to find those moments. Al, to your point, seeing if spouse or even kids can tag along. I know that recently Pumala Schmidt brought her daughter along to a whole series of Microsoft events, and it was a real eye-opener for both of them. Like, her daughter got to see what mom does and the kind of people that she interacts with, and mom got to show this whole other, no, I'm not just, going out for drinks or whatever. Like, there's real work happening.
Right.
Good. Okay, so those are the ways in which conventions are challenging.
Yeah. So one of the other ways that the conventions are challenging, and they're definitely not like some sort of vacation, unless, and I've started to do this more and more often, is I schedule a day ahead or a day on the back end to make them into some quiet time somewhere. If I'm going to some place that's awesome, and I know the convention is just going to be nonstop, one after another, 3 days of hard running the whole time, I'll schedule my return flight for 24 or 48 hours later, so that I can go to some sort of temple or some landmark or something like that, and debrief and decompress after that. Keith, I would think that for an introvert, that would be super helpful, just to check out for 24 hours,
Yeah, I know. I don't do many of the parties at any of the conventions. I'll make the rare exception, like Run DMC was at VMworld last night. Rubric had them, and, it's Run DMC. So
right,
you're going to do that. But, about 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm pretty, tired of people, so so for the most part at night, I don't normally do the big events just because, I spend so much of the day, I'm visible in most of these conferences, and I'll get to kind of the tough part at unknown, like where I'm not known at conferences are actually even worse than conferences that I'm known at.
And if I could go back to Mike's point, I guess it does depend on where you're going. If it's a unique location. So, for example, for me, Cisco and Tech Field Day were kind enough to allow me to join them for CiscoLive Europe in Barcelona. And I hadn't flown overseas in over 25 years. So I took full advantage of that opportunity. I arrived 2 days early, did some sightseeing, and I was able to kind of just chill, relax, take in the sights and sounds. And the rest of the week was relatively straightforward, very easygoing, not very stressful at all. But there was a lot involved, don't get me wrong, but it definitely helped the cause.
That's a really good thing to do, to go early and get acclimated. The other thing, too, is when something happens when you're at an event that is just like a significant event. I'll never forget the time I was at a conference and Columbine happened right there. So, this is that was a major event, and, it brings up all kinds of interesting dynamics associated with that particular event, and whatever it is. I know people that, were at an event when 9/11 happened. I know people that were at an event when that Las Vegas shooting happened a couple years ago.
Right.
And so how do you deal with that, especially if you're known to be religious?
So we're gonna dovetail into that in a minute, but I think to both of your points, I think that I was just saying, for people who don't get to go to conventions, why are conventions challenging? But I think just as meaningfully for folks who do go to conventions and may feel like they're heading toward that burnout phase, that's really good advice, is to schedule some extra time so that you feel like you're getting some personal time, some me time, as you might call it, associated with the event if you can. And then, Mike, to your point, when something big happens in the world, that does change the entire nature of the event. All of a sudden it becomes about something much larger than just, Keith, you said 40,000 people at reInvent. It's not just 40,000 people at reInvent. It's 40,000 people who are all having a shared national or international experience away from home, away from kids, away from their support network. And so everyone sort of becomes the support network for each other. And that can be somewhat transformative. And I think, Mike, where we are going with that is the next part of this topic, which is not just the ways conventions are challenging or different for everybody, but as people with a very particular religious or moral or ethical point of view, what do conventions represent? You were all talking about taking extra days before and after. So as an Orthodox Jew, the trick for me is that for the Sabbath, for Shabbat, I'm completely offline. Anything with an on-off switch can't be touched. So I can't fly, I can't travel, and even where I stay, hotel rooms become interesting if they have electric doors or entrances that are only, like it becomes this piece of calculus that is tricky. So I was at CiscoLive Barcelona last year, and my wife and I went out. My wife happens to have been born in Spain, but we came out several days ahead of time so that we could be there in time for the Sabbath, and we stayed several days after, but it creates this even larger buffer, which I'm sorry to say, or I'm happy to say, if it's Barcelona, if you're in Spain, not such a problem. It's wondering, like, who's going to complain about some more extra days in Spain?
Well, I'll throw you in Chicago in February. We'll see it.
Right. Okay. Right. Exactly. So this past CiscoLive, with it being Shavuot, I had to come out on Thursday, and Friday night I just sort of hunkered down and I was in the city in my hotel room. But those next 3 days offline, from Friday night through Saturday night, which was Shabbat, and then Sunday and Monday, which was the holiday of Shavuot, were all offline, and it became very complicated, and being away from family was tricky. So scheduling can be an interesting thing.
That's a lot of discipline. I give you a lot of credit.
Yeah, really.
It's, you know what, we knew what we were getting into, me and the family, and I will tell you, lessons were learned. And I will probably just opt to skip a convention if it happens like that again, because it was not the experience I wanted. But I appreciate the support. Okay, so scheduling, like I said, scheduling can be tricky for us with religious points of view. Not just scheduling getting there, getting home, but also daily scheduling, finding time and a place to pray. So I'm curious if you've had any sort of experiences about that.
Not necessarily. I mean, you can always find a location to pray if one is not provided. But for example, CiscoLive in Europe, and I'm sure the same here in the US, they provided a prayer room for all religions to use, which I found very convenient, very kind of them. It actually caught me by surprise. Maybe I'd never seen it or stumbled across such a thing. So I thought it was a nice gesture on their behalf.
So I saw the same thing. I was ecstatic. I actually took a selfie in the room. I was, had my talit and tefillin on. I'm like, this is awesome! So it was really wonderful. Not only was it a room to pray, but they had removed all iconography. There was no, like sometimes you'll find a place and there'll be crosses up or something like that. And it can be very challenging for some folks who are like, well, wait, but that's not my space. It's someone, they just made it a very generic space. CiscoLive US does not do that, just FYI. But it was deeply appreciated, especially because, you've got to duck away for 3 times a day or 5 times a day. And it's like, no, I got a place. Like, there's a room. I find a corner. I literally just walk off the floor and find a corner, just stare at a wall. And Like, what's he doing? Like, don't worry about it. It's okay.
So you're in the middle of your prayer. You're doing this some heavy lifting on prayer time with God, and all of a sudden some guy comes in and starts taking selfies because he's so excited that there's a prayer room.
That's a good point, Mike.
Who's that guy?
Okay, so the room was empty. I was not going to, take my enthusiasm. I was going to curb my enthusiasm if anybody else was in the room. But in fact, the room was all clear.
Oh, I'm so glad you were sensitive
Al,
about that.
You missed a chance. A Jew and a Muslim walk into a prayer room.
I wanted to, but I didn't know how that would come across.
No. I keep on waiting. I keep on waiting for that opportunity for for the folks who follow Islam and the Jews are like, yeah, we got to do that. Okay, this is our room. All right, cool, great.
So a Jew and a Muslim and a Christian go into the prayer room at CiscoLive.
Right.
I like that, Mike. That's a good one.
That's literally the joke.
That's right. That's really, you just found that's the tagline for the entire podcast.
Yes. I like
it. Okay. So finding a time and a place to pray. So with the prayer room, that was wonderful. But I have found that breaking away, if I'm in the middle of a session, a class, or I'm in the middle of a conversation, realizing that, so for Orthodox Judaism, there are specific times that you pray, windows in which you can pray. And the windows are hours long, but sometimes you realize, oh my gosh, the day's getting away from me. So finding both the time and the ability to break away is a challenge. I don't know if it's a challenge for any of you folks.
It could be. I mean, you can always make it up as long as, at least the way I feel it, you have the intent. You're doing it for the right reasons. You're not doing it to show off or gather attention. There's a purpose behind it, and it's most times than not, it's respected. It's not a big deal.
So another challenge that I think folks with religious points of view have with conventions is just eating. Just finding food. Now, a lot of conventions will have options. In fact, I remember laughing because of the 24 different dietary options. One was gluten-free, low-sodium halal. Like, that was incredibly specific.
It's pretty detailed.
Right? But not always.
Right.
So I don't know. What kind of food challenges have you run into being at conventions?
So every now and again, I'll do Daniel fast, where I'm not eating any meat or choice foods. Mm-hmm. You find that even it's hard to find non-choice foods during a convention. And the other thing is that and this is a challenge that vegans and vegetarians have. And then when you go for meals at night, like the convention will at least have vegan options. When you go to dinner with your friends at night, my tech field day brethren love their steak. And it can be really difficult to find someplace. So, that's happened to me more times than I would like, where I had bad timing, where I did this fast that didn't allow me to eat choice foods. Great thing about it is that the purpose of it is for me to pray and be reminded of my sacrifice. The bedtime part about it, that there's a lot of times to pray and ask for a sacrifice.
Yeah.
I think for me, the biggest challenge, if any, the food options are most times not readily available. And most conferences do accommodate, the needs of the specific religion, in my case, halal. But sometimes it's disappointing, to put it nicely, when food is not labeled properly. Mm-hmm. That's probably the easiest thing to accommodate.
What's an example of that, Al?
I mean, if there's a tray of food, like for example, I don't want to call it a specific company or conference, but let's just say it's a buffet style setup.
Yeah.
And they have trays of food one behind the other.
Right.
And there's no label. It'll just tell you, let's say for example, chicken, but there are other ingredients that you can see for yourself, but you're not necessarily sure what they are.
Yeah, so I'm Al's food taster, so I go in and Al's like, is there any pork in here? You know what, Al? I will let you know if there's pork in this chicken dish.
Right, but I appreciate you, Keith, but also for allergy related reasons as well.
Yeah,
right.
Like I'm allergic to peanuts, and it's not always obvious that peanuts are in a dish.
So one of my coworkers, Patrick Hubbard, also has a tree nut allergy. So a lot of times we will sort of circle the wagons and try to do that. Another one of my coworkers, Destiny Bertucci, who's another voice you'll hear on Technically Religious, has a gluten-free diet, and finding things that are really gluten-free. And I think we've also run into the well-intentioned, clueless staffer, you know, who's like, is any of this kosher? Oh, yeah, I'm pretty sure that over there is kosher. It's like, that's bacon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That reminds me of my Super Bowl. my vegetarian option for chili is a chicken chili. Like, you know, for vegetarians, I have a chicken chili.
Oh, okay. Yes, of course.
Yeah. You know, so there's no, like, you know, gluten-free. It's like, I see there are croutons on that salad. What are you doing? So you have to be sort of vigilant, and I like the idea of having a taster, having like a designated person to help out with that. And, you know, Al, to your point about like, well, what was the, you know, was it sautéed in a wine sauce?
Yeah, that could be the case as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So for a lot of us, especially those of us who have much more strict dietary needs, the conventions become a big building full of nope. Like, just, can you have this? Nope.
Yeah, you end up eating like a rabbit.
Yeah.
Which isn't bad, by the way, right?
No.
It's a good opportunity to, like Keith was saying before, you know, sort of sacrifice, right? What do they call it? Asceticism, right?
Right. Well, you become very sensitized both to the choices that you've made, and also you become very sensitized to the blessing of having food available. So, you know, in one respect, when you do, you know, when I do go to a convention, and there was one point I remember, it was CiscoLive Europe in Berlin, and they put out, and normally those buffets that you were talking about are just, again, nope, like I don't even look.
Right.
I'm not like, nope, it's not. And my coworker's like, well, just go look. You might have something. Like, no, ain't gonna do it. There was an entire set of coolers full of Ben & Jerry's ice cream pints, which is kosher. And I just like, I'll be having 7 of these.
Can I have it delivered to my room?
Yeah, it was great. Like, but the point wasn't like I gorged myself. The point was I was so grateful. I felt such a huge moment of, wow, what a blessing this is, that it was wonderful, and I was giddy from it. So that's sort of the other side of it when it happens. We know you can't listen to our podcast all day, so out of respect for your time, we've broken this particular conversation up. Come back next week, and we'll continue our conversation.
Thanks for making time for us this week. To hear more of Technically Religious, visit our website, technicallyreligious.com, where you can find our other episodes, leave us ideas for future discussions, and connect to us on social media.
Hey, there's this great convention happening next week in Cleveland. Who's in?
No, I'm good. It's
I'm sorry.